Hi, welcome back to Joe Blogs. In today's episode, I want to talk to you about what's happening in the Russian economy, and specifically to talk about the ongoing recruitment of more personnel to fight in Ukraine. Now, if you've been following the channel, you'll know that immediately following Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, it was estimated that around 500,000 people fled the country. They didn't want to run the risk of being called up and being forced to fight in Ukraine. And then later in 2022, when President Putin announced that he was mobilizing a further 300,000 soldiers, that basically people were going to be conscripted and forced to go and fight, it was estimated that another 700,000 people fled Russia. So in total, 1.2 million people have left since the start of the war as a direct result of what's happening in Ukraine. Now, in terms of what's happening with the population, that's caused Russia major problems because its birth rate is lower than its death rate. So more people are dying than being born, and therefore Russia has a declining population. And in order to try to supplement that declining population, Russia allows entry from other countries all around Europe. So in today's video, I'll take a look at what's happening with the birth rate and the death rate in Russia. We'll have a look at the Russian population pyramid and specifically focus in on what's been going on with immigration and emigration and which countries Russia is actually recruiting people from. We'll then talk about the latest moves in terms of deploying immigrants for the war in Ukraine. And we'll talk about the fact that certain groups have been forced to go to Ukraine to fight. So they signed up to be citizens of Russia and actually ended up finding themselves in the front line, not just fighting, but also trying to rebuild the cities in Ukraine that Russia has taken over. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to pose a question. Would you like to join the army in Russia to go and fight in Ukraine? Let's have a look at the latest recruitment video and see whether or not it persuades you to go and sign up.
А говорили, натовская не горит.
Горит. Горит так, что хер потушишь.
Yeah, that hasn't really persuaded me to go and fight in Ukraine. Urinating against a burning NATO tank, whether or not that was real or simulated, isn't the sort of thing that really motivates me to go and pick up a rifle and start shooting people. Don't know about you, but that certainly isn't something on my agenda. And then finally today, I'll wrap up with my summary as to what I think is happening in Russia right now, why Russia is having to recruit more soldiers from its immigrant workforce, and what the implications of all of this are for the Russian economy. But before we get started on all of that, I'd like to say once again, thank you so much to everyone that's supporting the channel. If you've signed up as a long-term supporter, thank you. Really, really appreciate that support. So if you've signed up through Patreon, where you'll get early access to my videos and be able to watch them advert-free, or YouTube membership, where you'll also get early access, or Buy Me a Coffee membership, thank you. That long-term support really does help to motivate me and keep me going. And if you've bought me a coffee or sent me a YouTube super thanks, thank you for the time and effort and generosity. Really does mean a lot to me. Now, before we dive into the detail as to what's been happening with Russian immigrants, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Ground News, who I've been working with since October 2022. So they're a long-time supporter of the channel. And what's great about Ground News is that they're not a news publisher, they're an aggregator. So they bring together stories from all around the world, which is fantastic for me when I'm researching topics to make videos about, because I can look at lots of different articles without having to spend hours surfing the web. And if we look at this example of an article where Russia was claiming that the US was to blame for civilian deaths, there were 22 articles posted, 50% of them leant to the right, 33% to the left. And if you scroll down and look at the actual articles themselves, you can see who the owner is, the level of factuality, and whether or not they lean to the left or the right. And the great news is that Ground News are currently offering Joe Blogs viewers a 40% discount on new subscriptions. And I'll use the Vantage subscription, so check that out. And you can get this by clicking in the link in the description below, which is ground.news/Joe, or using the QR code on the screen now. It's recently been reported that Russia rounded up 10,000 newly created Russian citizens, so people who've moved to Russia with the promise of gaining citizenship, and forced them to go and fight in Ukraine. Bloomberg reported that Russian authorities have already caught more than 30,000 new Russian citizens who had avoided registering with the military, and about 10,000 of them have already been sent to the Special Military Operations Zone. Bloomberg went on to report that Russia is now relying on thousands of often unwitted recruited workers from neighbouring countries to undertake the sprawling multi-billion-dollar reconstruction in the occupied territories of Ukraine. Job seekers coming to Russia from former Soviet Union states are being sent to Ukraine to work on construction projects, but have at times wound up digging trenches and fighting on the battlefield. In the process, they risk running afoul of laws in their homelands that could land them in prison. President Vladimir Putin has said Russia is spending more than 1 trillion rubles per year, which is around $11 billion, to rebuild occupied territories of Ukraine after his nearly 2-year-old invasion left huge areas in ruins. The effort, part of a strategy to solidify control over the illegally annexed regions, requires an influx of workers, but Russia already faces a severe squeeze on its labour force. Migrants are lured by job postings on Russian websites offering construction work for a salary much higher than the market average. For example, construction work in the eastern Donbass region can promise as much as 350,000 rubles per month, which is around $4,000, with accommodation, transportation and health insurance included. By contrast, a machine operator in a factory makes around $2,000 a month, already nearly 20% more than a year earlier, as the competition for employees amid the war has fueled a wage spiral. Valentina Chupik, a lawyer and director of the human rights non-profit organisation Tom Yahoney, said around 50 migrants from her practice went to Ukraine voluntarily, but the promised salary was not paid, and on the way back to Russia, they were not allowed to enter. She said she also knew of many cases of citizens from Uzbekistan and Tajikistan who'd been tricked into working for nothing and then forced to dig trenches in combat zones. One labourer said that people attempted to recruit him to fight in Ukraine. While I was sitting in the deportation centre in November, they actively recruited me and said that they would give me citizenship if I signed a contract. Although he was promised a lot of money, he opted to return home. They recruit everywhere, he said. A friend of mine was forced to sign a contract when he went to the migration centre to apply for a resident permit. Those who go to construction sites in the occupied territories are persuaded to fight there, he said, referring to the occupied areas of Donetsk and Luhansk. Russian officials have said thousands of apartment buildings were restored or built in the occupied territories, as well as hundreds of schools, museums, clinics and libraries. Speaking at an event earlier this year about the reconstruction effort, President Putin called it a key priority and said the occupied regions had in less than 2 years renovated 2,000 kilometres of roads and around 6,500 residential and other buildings, even if many of them had to be rebuilt from the ground up. He said Russia aimed to incorporate the territories at national level standards of living by 2030. According to a Russian database, in 2023, there were 47 building tenders worth more than 2 billion rubles for projects in Mariupol, mainly for constructing residential and administrative buildings, as well as infrastructure work. Many of the companies involved have contracts with the Defence Ministry, and because of that, workers can't make claims against the companies employing them. And it's estimated that around 2,000 migrants have ended up working in occupied areas after being deceived about the nature of the jobs they were applying for. Russia is increasingly relying on migrants in many spheres, including the military sector. And earlier this year, Vladimir Putin signed a decree making it easier for foreigners to obtain Russian citizenship for military service. In December 23, he said that 10 million migrant workers were working in Russia, and the economy now needs a record 2.3 million new workers, and 85% of companies in Russia are experiencing staff shortages. As I mentioned at the start of today's video, one of the reasons why Russia is now reliant on its migrant workforce is that in addition to the mass emigration of people that took place following the invasion, Russia also has a falling birth rate and a rising death rate. This chart shows the number of births per 1,000 people dating back to 1950 in Russia. And what this shows is that back in 1950, there were 27.6 births per 1,000 people. However, between 1950 and 1998, there was a dramatic fall in the birth rate, and by 1998, it had hit an all-time low for Russia of 8.9 births per 1,000 people. Now, Russia acknowledged that this was a major problem for them and launched a variety of different initiatives to try to encourage families in Russia to have more children. And between 1998 and 2014, the birth rate did start to increase and rose back to a high point of 12.9 births per 1,000. However, over the last 10 years, the birth rate had started to fall again and is now down to 11.1 per 1,000 of population. And this chart shows the death rate in Russia, the number of people that are dying per 1,000 of population, dating back also to 1950. And you can see that in 1950, the death rate was 12.2, which compared to the birth rate of 27.6 at that time. So Russia had an expanding population. A lot more people were being born than were dying. Between 1950 and 1963, there was a rapid fall in the death rate, and it got down to a low of 8.1 per 1,000, which compared to the birth rate in that year of 21.1. So the Russian population was still expanding rapidly at that point. However, in the 40 years between 1963 and 2003, there was a rapid acceleration in the death rate, and it hit a high of 16 per 1,000 in that year. And once again, the authorities recognised that this was a major problem for Russia and introduced a number of initiatives to try to lower the death rate. And by 2018, the death rate was down to 12.7 per 1,000. However, over the last 6 years, the death rate has started to increase again, and the current rate is 13.1, which compares to the birth rate of 11.1. So Russia still has a situation where more people are dying than are being born. This chart is Russia's population pyramid, which shows us the number of people in each age category from 0 to 4 all the way up to 100. And the blue section on the left-hand side shows the number of males in each of those age categories, and the red section shows the number of females. Now, the reason that this graph is called a population pyramid is that for an expanding country, the shape will be pyramidical. So basically, the largest group will be those aged 0 to 4, followed by 5 to 9, 10 to 14, and so on. And what that pyramid shows is that you've got an expanding population because a lot more people are being born than are dying. However, if you look at the shape of the Russian pyramid, you can see that it is not pyramidical. And the bars below 30 years of age are actually some of the smallest in Russia. And that reflects the fact that the birth rate has been declining rapidly. And that obviously represents a major problem for Russia as it moves forward because it's going to have a shrinking population. And the other thing to note about this chart is that the red section on the right-hand side, which shows the number of females, is significantly larger than the blue section. And that's partly as a result of the fact that Russia's been involved in a variety of wars over the last 30 years or so, and also because there's a higher incidence of people dying from poor lifestyles, either drinking too much, eating poor food, smoking, all of those sort of things, and that tends to affect the male population more than the female population. And this line chart shows the progression of the Russian population dating back to 1950. And what this shows is that between 1950 and 1993, the Russian population was expanding. However, following the breakup of the Soviet Union, which took place at the start of the 1990s, there was a lot of uncertainty about work and the future. There was a lot of depression. And as a result of that, the birth rate fell and the death rate rose. And over the last 30 years, the total population of Russia has fallen by around 5 million people. And you can see from the right-hand side of this chart that it's expected that the population of Russia will continue falling going forward. In view of the fact that Russia's death rate is above its birth rate, Russia is now reliant upon immigration to try to supplement its population. And I thought it'd be worth looking at which countries Russians are emigrating to, where they're fleeing to, and also which populations are deciding that they want to move to Russia. This chart shows a breakdown of the countries that Russians emigrated to in 2023. What this shows is that the largest country that people decided that they wanted to move to was Tajikistan, where almost 90,000 Russians emigrated to. Interestingly, the next biggest country that Russians emigrated to was Ukraine, where almost 81,000 moved to. Now that may well have been a stop-off point, and they may have decided to move on from Ukraine. It's not really known. We don't have any details on that. The third most popular destination was Kazakhstan, where over 49,000 Russians fled to, followed by Uzbekistan, where 41,000 went to, Armenia, where 37,000 went, Kazakhstan 37,000, Azerbaijan 21,000, Moldova 14,000, Belarus 13,000, Turkmenistan 9,000, almost 8,000 Russians moved to both India and China, 5,000 to Vietnam, 4,000 to Georgia, and 2,000 to Germany. Now, in terms of immigration, people deciding that they want to leave their home country and move to Russia, by far the largest country providing immigrants for Russia was Tajikistan, and over 171,000 moved to Russia in 2023, followed by Kazakhstan, where 54,000 moved from, Ukraine, where 51,000 relocated from, 49,000 people moved from both Armenia and Kazakhstan, 44,000 from Uzbekistan, 24 from Azerbaijan, 23,000 from Moldova, 13,000 from Turkmenistan, and 12,000 from Belarus. And this chart shows Russia's net migration dating back to 2000. So what we're looking at here is basically the difference between the number of people who are leaving Russia permanently, so Russians who no longer want to live there, against the number of people who are moving to Russia for economic purposes. So basically moving from poorer countries located close to Russia into Russia because they're going to earn more money. And what this shows is that back in 2000, net migration into Russia was almost 3 million people. Now between 2000 and 2003, that number fell to around 2.5 million. Between 2003 and 2008, there was an increase in net migration, and it actually rose above 3 million in both 2007 and 2008. However, since 2008, there has been a year-on-year reduction in net migration. And in 2023 and 2024, it fell to 620,000, which is by far the lowest figure out of any of the 24 years shown on this chart. But interestingly, it still remains in positive territory. There are more people moving to Russia than leaving Russia. But obviously the difference is that you're losing Russian nationals, people who are born and bred in Russia and identify as Russian, and you're taking in immigrants from other countries who don't have Russian citizenship. And that's really the purpose of today's video. We've been looking at the fact that Russia has a lot of immigrants, and it's now deploying some of these immigrants into Ukraine, both for building and reconstruction purposes and also to join the military. Now, alongside the Eastern European countries that we've just looked at in the tables, Russia is also trying to recruit immigrants from a variety of other countries.
News of Cubans ending up in the Russian military emerged in September when the government, a long-standing ally of Russia, said it had arrested 17 people linked to a human trafficking ring that lured Cubans to fight for Moscow.
Many in Ethiopia have voiced solidarity with Russia, which has enjoyed close relations with the Horn of Africa nation since the Soviet era. Queues of hopeful men have been forming outside the Russian embassy in Ethiopia's capital, Addis Ababa. Their hope? To enlist to fight for Russia in Ukraine. What began as a trickle of volunteers swelled over 2 weeks to scores. Men in the queue said they'd been drawn by rumours of monetary incentives on social media and the possibility of work in Russia after the war.
It's been reported that Syria's military has been recruiting troops from its own ranks to fight alongside Russian forces in Ukraine, promising payments of $3,000 a month, a sum up to 50 times a Syrian soldier's monthly salary. It's recently been reported that police in Nepal arrested 10 people for allegedly scamming unemployed young men into joining the Russian army. The suspects charged people $9,000 for tourist visas and sent them to Russia, where they were recruited to the Russian army. So what's the summary and conclusion today? Well, I wanted to post this video because I think the total population of Russia is a really key issue when you're looking at the future of the economy. Russia is still a country that's dependent on its workforce. It needs people to generate GDP and therefore to grow the economy. And what we've seen from the data in today's video is that the birth rate in Russia has been falling, the death rate has been rising, which means that in terms of its natural population, we've got a fall in the total number of people. Now, that's been actually made worse because of the invasion of Ukraine. Around 1.2 million people decided that they no longer wanted to live in Russia, so they've emigrated permanently. Now, Russia has been able to offset that slightly because it's still an attractive place for a lot of nationals to work. If you live in some of the Eastern European countries surrounding Russia, Russia pays its workers a lot more than those countries. And so from an economic point of view, people are still interested in moving to Russia to get that money and send it back to their families. And Russia has actually been offering citizenship to a lot of these individuals to try to encourage them to go and join and work in the workforce. But there is now a sting in the tail because Russia has decided that there is a price to pay for that citizenship. And a lot of these immigrants are now being rounded up and told that they've either got to go and work in Ukraine, so the occupied areas where Russia has destroyed a lot of the buildings and the infrastructure. It's now starting to rebuild all of it, and it's bringing in migrant workers to help with that rebuilding process. But also some of those immigrants are now being told that they've actually got to join the military and fight on Russia's behalf. So there is a very heavy price to pay here. You may be offered a lot more money than you're getting in your home country, but if by signing up to those terms and conditions, you suddenly find yourself on the front line in Ukraine with a machine gun facing Ukrainian forces, I don't think that's what most of those people are signing up for when they decide that they're going to move to Russia. And I think this is really quite a big issue because I don't think it's right to be using immigrant labour to go and fight your battle in Ukraine. That's not what those people wanted to do when they crossed the border and decided that they were going to start working in Russia. And what this tells us is that Russia is still struggling for manpower. It's struggling for manpower on the streets of Russia in terms of employment. A lot of companies are still short of workers. That's driven up wages, which has driven up inflation and is causing major problems in the economy. And it's also short of people on the front line. And the combination of those two factors is a major problem for Russia. And as we saw from the chart, it's expected that the population will continue declining over the next 50 years. So that's going to put more pressure on Russia, and potentially this issue of manpower could accelerate some sort of peace process, because at some point Russia will run short either of soldiers or workers, or most likely both, and that's going to have a devastating impact both on the war in Ukraine, but also and most importantly on the Russian economy. So hopefully you've enjoyed today's video, you found it useful, informative and thought-provoking. If you've liked what I've said, then please give me a thumbs up. Thank you for watching this video all the way through to the end, and here's something to put a smile on your face.